This talk is a world historic talk, and you'll understand why toward the end. But we're going to start with some high-level arithmetic.
Uh-oh.
You got a whole cup. 2 plus 2 equals 4. Clear, no problem. 2 plus 2 equals 4. 2 apples plus 2 apples equal
4 apples.
2 apples plus 2 pears
2 apples
equals
4 fruits. 2 apples and 2
Four.
4 fruits.
4 fruits.
Like you said.
So, what do we see? That when we deal with numbers, clean, no problem. When we apply the number to something in existence and we observe, like the 2 apples and 2 pears, so what do we see is that we have to put together 2 apples and 2 pears, we have to introduce a higher term under which both are individuals part of the species, but we introduce a more abstract or a higher level term. Then we say, well, yeah, it's not 2 pears, it's not 2 apples, it's 2 things. Now, what happens is, as you start to apply this to more and more things, you wind up with something at the top called being.
Called what?
Being. For the Greeks, if you keep going like this, and you take other things and so forth, everything plus this, plus this, plus this, plus this, everything eventually relates to being. I want to start this evening by exploding some myths about metaphysics before we get into the text. And one of them is that it has no value. It's and these are I call them half-truths because they're true in part, but false in other respects. Okay, another example: the idea of an idea. Can you have an idea? You have an idea in a statement, or whatever. This is an apple, whatever the thing is. Can you have an idea about that idea?
Sure, why not?
Everybody says sure. Now, can you have an idea about the idea of the idea?
Some people could.
Now, the question is, how are we going to differentiate between the first level, second level, call it just level for the sake of conversation? How are we going to differentiate them if there's nothing different in each of the levels? So you're going to say, well, label it first level, second level, third level. But that begs the question. You beg the question. The question is, what criteria could we use that will give us, if the proposition in the second or third level was different in some respect, okay, then you can keep going. As long as you find differences, you could keep going. But it turns out that this is a big, big problem. The question is, can you have more than one? Can you have a meta-meta level? Can you have a meta-meta level? That's a very big question, and that's a question of metaphysics. Okay. Myths about metaphysics. We'll call them half-truths. So one view is metaphysics deal with the unseen, with the non-observable. You can't see it, non-observable. Like numbers, particles, we don't see any particle. We see the localization of the particle in a medium, but we don't catch the particle. In philosophy of science, they call these theoretical entities. So what do you mean theoretical entities? In the sense that we don't see it. Numbers we don't see. We don't see Euclid's axioms.
The God particle.
So, huh?
The God particle.
Well,
we don't see the wind.
Wait. No, you're right. No, this is a big thing. Because there's no word for air. in Chumash, there's no word for air.
Really?
Wind is the word, not air.
Avur.
There's no word for air. Avir is a Hebrew contemporary term. There's no word avir in the text. Okay, so one viewpoint, one thing about myths is it's not observable. It deals with numbers, deals with particles. It's very abstract. People say it's very abstract. Like as you just illustrated with fruit. You go up the line and you have to shift levels of abstraction. What's good and what's true and what makes sense at one level of abstraction has to sometimes require another level to make the thing more clarified better. Okay, so it has unseen, it's abstract, it's God. That people who somebody says you believe in God, yeah, well that's metaphysics. That's metaphysical. It carries over to mysticism, where you say you're metaphysical, and this carries over to mysticism. But certainly God is in the picture. It carries over to magic in antiquity. Well, how did they understand the magic whole phenomenon? And that's all. And one other view is it has no value for life. Indeed, you go through life. Do you have to reflect and study a domain which is, for the most part, irrelevant to your life? If you want to study the body, you have some psychology, do biology, and at least read articles, have material that's related. That's related to life. But this is related to the mathematician, to the philosopher, but not to the normal person. I mentioned once many times about number. What is a number? Well, that's a very big metaphysical question. It's not a question for a mathematician. Mathematician comes in the first day, he's going to deal with number theory. We're going to deal with Euclidean geometry. And then he talks for 2 minutes and says something all about the Greeks and this and that. And now we said, okay, now we're finished. Let's go and we do number theory. Or we study Euclidean geometry and so on, so on, so on, so on. So the working mathematician who's closest to these kind of things, it has no effect. It has no effect on mathematics. It can have, anything can have effect on life in terms of different results, effects, causes, and so on. But in terms of the subject matter, it's irrelevant. And mathematics is the furthest away from life. I mean, you're dealing with something that's, quote, abstract. Abstract to the level where the mind makes it. The mind does all this. What about the body? What about the feelings? What about the rest of the person? It somehow gets bypassed in the whole orientation. So the myths come down. Well, it has no value for life. It's you can live without it. And indeed, 99% of the population over civilization time have lived without it. What do you need it? What's the point? Okay. It's old-fashioned. Everybody knows that Greece was the beginning of philosophy, and the philosophy took on what we call metaphysics, and so we call it metaphysical philosophy or metaphysics. And then after the Hellenistic period, after the Greek world got linked together with the Roman period and the birth of Christianity, after that, God was in the picture and had to be dealt with in the metaphysics. So you didn't see him, and you had special property, and indeed you had the notion of infinity. And I know for myself, it took many, many years to work through the whole issue to realize that infinity and infinite and infinitesimal have absolutely no meaning other than in mathematics.
Right.
There is no such thing as infinite in anything other than mathematics. There, infinite does work. It has, we can have an infinite set, we can have subsets, whatever, but we can have infinity as a number, and so on. but it could function in theorems, in proofs, and so on, and has meaning and carries meaning from the domain of mathematics. But it has no meaning in terms of anything else, including God. But God came into the picture as having to be dealt with by metaphysics, because metaphysics deals with anything and everything that exists. What that means, we're going to get to. What do you mean? It's sort of using words, everything that exists. Well, is it something that exists, a being? We start to get befuddled right off the bat, and we're in a whole mishmash of terms and so forth. Okay. Now, these are half-truths. I call them half-truths because, in part, they are correct. So, first, abstract. It turns out that the history of metaphysics, like a field of study, has a history. And when you study the history, you see that there's a movement from the abstract to the concrete. In other words, as exemplified, we have, let's take three thinkers or four thinkers. Take the Greeks, Plato and Aristotle. Let's take Descartes. Let's take Kant. Let's take Heidegger. Metaphysicians, okay? So what do we see in relation to the problem of a myth, that it's abstract, it's too abstract? The history of metaphysics has shown that it started with what you would call high abstraction, but it's ending in the concrete. How so? Heidegger, who's one of the leading contemporary metaphysics people, who inherited the tradition and wrote on the tradition and developed this whole where he stands in relation to the tradition, he says, to show you that we're not talking about this myth of abstraction, he says, what I write in the books that I publish is not discourse about, it's not discourse about beings, it's to show beings. Woohoo! Now look, to write about something is very further, that's much more abstract than to show the thing, to show the artwork, to show the painting. That's direct relationship. But so Heidegger says that the history of metaphysics shows you that everybody thinks it's abstract. It's going the other way. It's going the other way. Sure, it uses terms that, relative in relation to the ordinary world, are abstract. However, they are functioning to show the concrete. So this myth about abstraction is, I call it a half-truth, because yes, it has terms and terminology which, in comparison to the ordinary world, okay, are abstract. But the point of the whole thing is that the concept of metaphysics has shifted over time from discourse about to showing. So I call it like a language product. And the best way to conceive of it in the contemporary picture is like an art product. It's a product made out of words, out of sentences, out of phrases. And it's there to show, like show and tell. It's to be shown. So it's a best way to look at it is like an art object, instead of having it be a painting that hangs on the wall. It's a piece of word, tchotchke, whatever you want to call it, that's showing certain things. And when the onlooker looks at the title of the painting, or without a title, and the onlooker brings to it his insights and so what, then we have an interrelation between the art object and the person. And so we have to work out what exactly is the painting. Is the painting the thing that hangs on the wall, or is the painting the thing in its interaction with the human being who looks at it? If nobody looks at the painting, is it a painting? Well, for the auction, for the, for cleaning up on a big, sure, it's a painting. But that's the problem in terms of when you get to the terms of the viewer. So what happens is that when you get to somebody like Heidegger, who's a modern representative of the tradition, you see that he is, instead of going abstract, he's going concrete. So much so that he takes ordinary language and he uses ordinary terms and ordinary phrases to help show the picture that he's trying to get across. And so if you look, take any page on Heidegger, take any page by random, look on the page, you'll see single quotation marks more than any other book that you would read. Because what he's done was said, in effect, look, if somebody says in ordinary language, the ordinary world, not an abstraction in the life world. If somebody says, I'm in, you're out. Well, he says, well, that sounds like some kind of space talk. Maybe the word out in the ordinary context and the word in will give us some clues as to what space is. What space is a big issue, like what number is. See? Abstract and so on. But he's getting clues to show you what this thing is from the ordinary world, the experiential world. The experiential world, we say, oh, I'm in. I'm playing cards. I'm in. Let me say, I'm out. So that's a big innovation. And in terms of the first point that I'm making here about exploding this myth of abstraction, it's not abstraction per se. It's not discourse about. Discourse about Eino Chinami is more abstract than showing through the discourse. Showing is more immediate, more what I call in the life world. So here you have, in the history of metaphysics, a movement from the Greek orientation to being, to Descartes and the scientific revolution, where there was a big switch in the whole concept of metaphysics, to Kant, and then into Heidegger, where we see a real radical shift in methodology and in understanding of the whole idea of metaphysics. And so there are many books that Heidegger wrote, many titles of essays. What is metaphysics? It's not just taken for granted that it's about the abstract and it's about being. It's how you enter. So the revolution in Descartes was, whereas the Greeks entered from the point of view of existence, of entities, of, quote, being, Descartes entered from the point of view of knowledge. He said, I think, therefore I am. Thinking was the entry. The goal was the same. The goal was, how do we get an understanding of the big picture that deals with numbers and all of these things. But the entry into the questions came from the nature of knowledge, nature of thinking, which for Descartes was mathematical thinking. Descartes was a mathematician, the father of analytic geometry, and when he said the word think, the paradigm for his use of the word is mathematical thinking. Then the problem becomes, well, we're going to have a universe more than mathematics. So the problem is, how do we link up this beginning point with the rest of the material? And in the process, because it's a different beginning point, things shift. There's an implicit critique or shift of Greek philosophy. Greek philosophy now becomes dated to a period before the scientific revolution, before mathematical thinking was the entry. There was mathematical thinking. Euclid was Greek. But it wasn't an entry into the metaphysics. So the goal is the same, but the entry is different, and therefore implicit in that new stance is a critique of the Greeks, but still we're in the domain of discourse about. Descartes didn't make the move to show, to analogy to an art product, to show through the language and through the word and through the concept to show something, not to say something about it. He was still in the old tradition on that respect. When Heidegger deals with the history of metaphysics, how metaphysics went from the Greeks to Descartes, the revolution, and then into Kant, who was the highlight, the perfectibility, shall we say, of the entry that started with Descartes through knowledge. So that here we had metaphysics entering by being, metaphysics entering by knowledge. And when you go and you look and you read the Heidegger material, you see that Heidegger himself can be well represented by saying he's entering through language. Not through knowledge, but through language, as indicated by his method and other things that we'll talk about. But the point is, so we have three entries into metaphysics. We have the classical Greek entry, which is being, the Cartesian entry, which is knowledge, thinking, and the Heidegger entry, which is language. And yours truly has added a dimension or added a richness to Heidegger by emphasizing not language per se, but performative language. In other words, there's three fundamental uses of language. There's assertion. You assert something and you have sentences, propositions, and so forth. And then you command, and we write it with an exclamation point, do this, and so on. And then we have performatives. Performative is an act, a language act, whereby you say, Harei ze hegdish, or Harei ze kiddushin, or whatever. And by those words, you now take on, or the person you're talking to takes on a status of being married. The guy, he says the words, Hareyat mekudeshet li. He gives a ring because it's words that are so powerful. He wasn't married the day before. It's the same guy. But now he can't go out with any girl he wants to. He has consequences of that. But look, 1 minute, his whole life changed. But the interesting part is that it's the use of language which has done it, which has entered into the picture. So I say Heidegger touched on the linguistic, the language entry into metaphysics, but there's a number of dimensions which he didn't touch. Now, for example, he uses the word announce. The sense data, for example, the sense, touch, taste, and so on, announces his language, announces the way these things enter into the human world. Color, hardness, and so on and so on. So these things are part of the ordinary world, and they enter into ordinary life. But in talking about it, or in trying to show, we're so used to saying talking about it, that you can't even get used to having a language. Very important, having a language, because he's writing in sentences. So he's making assertions. But he's trying to show you that assertive language is not the fundamental issue here. Assertive language goes together with the Greeks, goes together with Descartes, but does not go together sufficiently in the contemporary understanding in Heidegger. So you have the three approaches, and you have these entries, and Heidegger has this third entry. So he would say, what was the example I used? Announce. So that what happens is that there's the touch, color, hardness, and so on, are ordinary world things, and they are being announced. Okay? He says they announce their value for human life. To announce is a performative. To declare is a performative. When you say, I declare this to Queen Mary, you've got to say the words, I declare, or have a language which understands that it's implicit. But it's a performative. So he uses the word, he's talking about Descartes. He says Descartes posited the axiom set of mathematical thinking. To posit is a performative. So Descartes, if you say, so Descartes doesn't say that. He doesn't put a footnote. Heidegger doesn't put a footnote to say, oh, when I say posit, I have in mind a performative. I say, had he done that, he would have eliminated 50% of confusions and difficulties in his whole exposition of things, because he would constantly pump and remind the reader that when I'm talking, he says, remember, I'm showing, not discoursing about, and I am putting a primacy on the performative and how it functions. What does it give us in terms of the picture of the metaphysics? The goal is the same. Not really the same, because it shifts, and there'll be different emphases, and that makes difference. Okay, but the point here is you see that there are these three entries, and Heidegger, you can't say he didn't understand what a performative is, but he doesn't talk much. He doesn't have the word. When I read the stuff, you'll read my book, and you'll see it's underlined. All the places that he says performatives, I have a little underline. Because I am looking at the language in a richer, what I would say is a richer way than he himself. But I'm saying I'm following a line that's certainly in Heidegger. I'm perfecting it much, much more with the understanding of the performative. And so words like to posit, to announce, and so on, so on, so on, you go down the line, every page, every single page has in it all of these performatives. And the performatives in part are made up of familiar concepts, supposedly, and changed ideas, changed word, language, and so forth that Heidegger puts in these single brackets. And so it's proclaiming. Well, now the question becomes, how does that work? How does that relate to other things? How does it answer questions that you want to talk about? But the emphasis is on the linguistic emphasis, the language. Now, you heard before, even in the last session about the Hanukkah story, you heard before, everybody knows I'm very big on the performative. Okay. As a Torah person, coming out of the halakha deals exclusively with performative utterances, performative statuses. The halakha, and you read Baruch Ber on the halakha, Birkat Shmuel will tell you, halakha does not deal with cows, chickens, tables, and vegetables. Halakha deals with the relationship between statuses. So that you have a three-part, I'm not spending any time on that tonight, but you have a three-part picture of the conditions required to make the status, bestow the status. Then you have the status bestowed, and then you have the consequences of the status. And they are not causal. There is not an effect. When the guy says, Hareyat lekudeshet, and he's not a katan, because a katan is a condition. You have to be a certain age with mental ability and so on, so on, so on. So that's a condition. If you fulfill the condition and you make the utterance, the performative utterance, so you establish the status. But it didn't cause the status. There's no cause and effect here. In logic terms, we have three sets of if-then relationships which have nothing to do with causality, and they don't take place in time. What do you mean don't take place in time? My grandchild, 2-year-old, learning how to speak, and so he says, Hareyat. He has a girlfriend. But the point is, he says, Hareyat. Well, he didn't say anything. What do you mean he didn't say anything? I got it on tape. We're saving the tape. First time he said that, you save it. He didn't say anything. What does that mean he didn't say anything? In law, he didn't say anything. Nothing happens. And when the guy says, Harayat Makudeshali, and he's a katan, nothing happened. So nothing happened. And so causality presupposes that something happened and something's in time and the effect comes after the cause and so on and so on and so on and so on. So this you should know just what derech hagav. To understand the halachic system, one has to understand this basic beginning point that the law, the halakha, and any advanced legal system is concerned with statuses and their interrelations, and has nothing to do with causality. If you don't understand it, you can't understand, and you will get confused in the Gemara, in the Shakavataya of the Inyan, and so on. You must, when you study this material, you must think like a lawyer and relate to the statuses and how they relate to each other. And it's not as simple as I said, Harayat Megudeshili, because a status of X in relation to one context, in another context, could be a condition. In other words, it's not just a fixed list of you look at the dictionary and you get everything cleaned down, that's the end of it. You have to now show in the analysis, the legal analysis of the law, whatever you're dealing with, you have to show where are the performatives, where are the statuses, and how do they function in relation to the consequences. So we're not dealing with causality, we're dealing like something like in mathematics, in number. And indeed, in the brisk tradition, they likened, Rav Soloveitchik and so on, they likened halakha to mathematics, in the sense that you are concerned with relations, not with causality. Very important point. Okay, so this is the myth of abstraction. It's in part true, depending on how we're entering, how we're looking at things. Yes, in relation to ordinary life things, these are abstract. Going with that is a realization that there may be an overkill in metaphysics, because we're looking for clarity, looking to show the clarity, and not get confused between existence, entity, being. These are all words. Existence, you can't even talk. They're being words. But they have different meanings, and they function differently. So how are we to get a handle on all of that? That's part of the problem. Okay, so in relation to abstract, it's a half-truth. In relation to vagueness, it turns out that ordinary language, not constructed languages, not a computer language and not a constructed language of mathematics, which is an assertive language, both are assertive linguistic uses, but one is a construction and one is not. One has a symbolism, we have signs and so on and so on, and we have algebra, we have logic and so on, symbolic logic. And these things are sharply defined. The goal is to get them pinned down, sharply defined. It turns out that in ordinary language, we don't have that sharpness. We have conversation, and we talk in conversation. And in conversation, take any slice, take an hour of conversation, listen to it, you will see all three uses of language in the same conversation, without labels and without switching. First, we're talking about something, okay, and we're expressing my opinion, the person I'm talking to, your opinion, and so on. And then all of a sudden, it says, oh, you should go tonight to the movies. Where did that come in? Well, you know how conversation goes, bing, 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 just move. All of a sudden, a command came in, or giving advice. Giving advice is a performative use, okay? So, making a command is a second use of language. So there are assertions, commands, and performatives. And in every slice of conversation, you will see, take any page you want, I bet a penny on each page, I wind up with 10 cents and a quarter and $1 and $50 and so on. In other words, take anything you'll see in ordinary conversation, you have all three uses of language that just flip like a movie thing, just flip from one to the other with no indication, nothing else. And the question in metaphysics becomes, how does that happen? What's happening when you posit something? When you posit an axiom. You posit the axiom. What does that mean? One thing it means is that you don't look for a ground. You don't have to go and prove it. You don't prove an axiom. You use an axiom to make proofs inside of the system, but you don't prove an axiom. So now the question is, the performative allows you to make it. Now the question is, how's it going to function? One property it has is that you don't search for grounds. You don't have to do more than just state it. That's what the performative did. Now there are consequences, fine. But one characteristic is that you don't have to look for grounds, for a basis. You may have to look for a basis for other things, concerned other things. As you start relating the performative to other things in your picture that you want to present, yes, you may have to always get lost. You may have to
Grounds?
you may have to search for grounds. But there are givens and grounds, groundings and givens. And in metaphysics, it's all important to discern where and what requires groundings and what are functioning as givens, as givenness. And look how far we look, aside from the point I made about the concrete, but look where we are. Sure, at that level, I'll give you the book, you won't understand one word. Because we're coming in with biases. First of all, that it's a bias of the ordinary language. Then you're dealing with assertion or show. Where did you get the idea? I didn't make it up. Heidegger said it. That's it. That's the way he looks at what he's doing. He wants you to do showing as distinct from talking about. Well, unless you read it or got it by yourself, you don't understand what he's doing. I mean, a guy put a painting on the wall and you're listening to a record because it just happened to be at the same time. You're not looking at the painting. He just put the painting to decorate the wall, but what's going on here is listening to music. I mean, it's all misplaced. So all of that complexity is built into the problem of metaphysics and these half-truths. Okay, so I say about these where are we, half-truths? Talk about the abstract, talk about the unseen, talk about the particles, talk about God in the picture, talk about mysticism, magic, and antiquity, and then old-fashioned, no value for life. Just an aside about antiquity, Heidegger uses many, many analogies to the world of antiquity. Why? In my language. In my language. But in my view, one of the fundamental differences, or perhaps the fundamental difference between antiquated cultures, as in yielded by anthropology, especially by Levi-Strauss, who was the king of anthropology in the 20th century. I think he lived up to 100, and he passed away recently, not so fair. But in any event, why did Heidegger do that? Just like he coins new phrases with single quotes to show, like he has to, like a painter. Sometimes you have to do certain kind of color combinations and certain mixtures to get a certain shade that is it's off the beaten track, but you need it for the painting. So he needs this. So Heidegger, he says, look, if you look at antiquity, you see there was a predominance of performative language, and indeed command language. The Chumash, which is our ancient text, well, it's command language all over the place, not assertion, and performatives. And it took me a lifetime of study as a Torah person to realize that something came up, was triggered off from Heidegger, which I went to the machine in the last 6 weeks, 5 weeks. I wrote 70 pages off the cuff on all kinds of Torah points because I couldn't read a page. As soon as I read a page, this popped out, that popped out, this popped out, that popped out. I had to go up. I go to the machine, do a page, write something on this, write something on that, go back, read another page. I can't get a continuation to read. I can't read more than one page at a time because my mind is just banging with all these ideas. One of them is the big one that we're talking about tonight, about how the Bereshit story of creation is not a cosmology. Woohoo! Is not a cosmology. It is a metaphysics being entered into by language, not by knowledge like Descartes, and not by being like Plato and Aristotle, but by language. And how do we see that? Because the pasuk indicates right off the bat, says Bereshit working with Shemayim v'Torah, Ruach Elokim merachefet al hamayim. Machrefet here means like causing ripples on a pond. It means readiness. One of Heidegger's big terms of readiness. So readiness, that's what it was. Elokim has readiness. It's ready to do something. What's he ready to do? He's ready to make a metaphysics. To construct a picture in words that is mistakenly viewed as a cosmology. It can be read as a cosmology, but it is not in essence a cosmology. It is an epistemology, a view of knowledge, an entry into metaphysics from the point of view of knowledge, or knowledge refined by language. Merachefet, Ruach Elokim merachefet al hamayim, readiness. The next pasuk is Vayomer Elokim yehi or. Vayehi or. Finished. Yehi is a performative. Let there be. Let there be is a performative. So right off the bat, when we finish the first two psukim, which I'm not talking about them tonight, we'll talk about some other time, but the last part of that pasuk is readiness. Readiness for what? Readiness to give over a new understanding of the text. It is not, put it mildly, it's not only, I don't have to argue one or the other. It's not only, it can be read as a cosmology. Fine. It satisfies the whole tradition for 2,000 years. Mm-hmm. But it also can be read, and more significantly so, as an epistemology. And it has 6 fundamental components. Each day of the story is going to talk about different components of this epistemology. Now that is a big, big chidush for me. Now I haven't found it in somebody else, in other people. For me that's a big, big chidush to shift the whole understanding of the Bereshit story, which then has implications for the whole text. And I'll show you right away. And so to shift that whole thing is, I mean, we talk about paradigm shift in science, paradigm shift in Torah. I mean, that's a fantastic paradigm shift. It throws off work for 100 years to do all the things that I can't do. I don't know enough to do everything. I'm only setting forth the form. Setting forth the move, the direction, and intimations. I don't know enough. I'm not in the league. There'll be a big guy who really will be able to polish up the form that I'm presenting. But that's the basic point. Wait a minute. So we got this entry, and I'm going to discuss that tonight. But it affects the whole Chumash. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe. Vayomer Elokim. And he said, there's at least 5 million ways or meanings of said. He had a headache, and he said. He didn't have a headache, and he said. Well, they're two different things. Because we now have an implication of what I just said before about with the text. Let's say these are performatives. Elokim declared. Elokim declared light. It gives you the form. It's a performative. So it says Elohim did it. But the text says Vayomer Elohim, or Vayomer Hashem. But why translate Vayomer in assertion language? We're talking about performative. So now if we translate Elohim declared, well, it knocked out my whole life. As a Torah person, my entry into Torah was via philosophy. Not via Heidegger, but via philosophy. A great philosophical education with some of the greatest in the 20th century. And I should be down in Ripley, because I probably took 150 courses in philosophy. It's probably one of the... But in any event, the point was, I entered with a mixture of me and common sense and life and identity and all the rest of the problem and thing, but with a truth orientation. So from one point of view, the fact that it was an assertion, and I read it as an assertion, assertions are true or false. Performatives are valuable or not valuable, or functioning or don't function. If the guy ran away and he didn't get married and so on, so we have aberration that blocks the thing from working, but it has nothing to do with truth or falsity. But my whole life was built on truth or falsity. So indeed, it said, God said, so I went into philosophy on the God problem. Does Judaism, Torah, require existence of God? What's your answer? True or false? Yes or no? Well, had I started 80 years ago, had I started with the Heidegger entry, I wouldn't have had the whole point. I wouldn't have pursued truth. Well, who's talking about truth? If it said God declared, he declared for who? He declared for Moshe. He declared for the people of the time, and so on and so on. He didn't declare for me. I don't have to say he declared for me, so I can disagree with what he said. That's an ancient world. What do I have to put myself there? I live in the contemporary world. So, some people say, oh, it's not for me. Other people say it is for me. But there's no truth or falsity. Well, from one point of view, my whole life would have been something else. Go into business, be a Jewish mother, be a doctor. You know, my mother always said to my son, the doctor. Yeah. Book knowledge is not worth a nickel. My mother's a very practical person, worked for the government and so on. And her darling son, book knowledge is not worth a nickel. And indeed, books are very slow. Can't sell much today. They aren't worth much. In any event, when I sell them, at least I know they're going to be read. They go to libraries and out in the world, so it's some value for the thing. Okay, so here you see right off the bat is the entry through the language, Yehi or, Vayehi or, okay, the entry through the language, and how the whole Chumash is now a filling out in different slices of experience of the human world, of the experiential world, different slices having to do with kinship, having to do with relations of man and woman and so on, different slices of ordinary life experience that when you enter them from the point of view of the performative, you are pushing out of the mind automatically truth or falsity and bringing in the richness and the types of questions that go with the story. So we had it here at the table. David brought it up once, a number of times, in the Akedah story. So I asked, well, where's all the emotion? This is a traumatic thing. The sacrifice, call upon, sacrifice your son. Where's the emotion? There's no feeling. It's like, it's the first time the word Ava is used, you know, in the Chumash. Where's all the schmaltz? Where's all the human dimensions? Well, for whatever the reason was, that in the putting of the story down, this was not important, but it's important to me. It's important for the contemporary reader. So what we can do now is dialogue the text. The text is not the usual text, which is setting up assertions, right? And getting you as the the reader to understand what the author meant by the assertions in a truth or false kind of a context. We're trying to show something. Well, the showing, in part, is how much I bring to it, how much the viewer brings to it. Like if you don't know much about music, so it's music, mezzo, But on the other hand, there was a concert today without a conductor. Linda said it, saw it in the paper, it was announced, because it's a big orchestra. I forget the name. She said, I said, hey, there's no, she pointed out there was no conductor. But a big full, sometimes you have a sextet or whatever, and you don't have a conductor. One of the people, the violin or whatever, is the leader. Or you see the head motions on the piano or whatever. But here was a full orchestra. Linda said she saw it in the paper, a full orchestra, no conductor, playing Beethoven or whatever it was. Okay. Where are we? It's so exciting. I mean, the thing. Anyway, about the Chumash. So here we have, when it's talking relevance, when it's talking performative language, and Elohim is declaring, advising, commanding. It's not true or false. So if I resonate, it's talking to me. I can have dialogue, the text. I'm in every piece. Moshe Rabbeinu was in every reader who reads the text. In the sense that we're talking. So the goal is not to understand Moshe, to understand the ancient society. The goal is to understand us. We're the ones who are living. We're the ones who are the center of existence. And so when we enter the text, in part we're learning something about the Hebrew culture, the Hebrew society, and so on and so on. On the other hand, we're learning most about ourselves. How what we bring to it resonates or doesn't resonate, and in what respects. And so every piece of the Chumash changes its meaning. It's your entry. When I wrote this Perush, 900 pages, it's going to be redone. Baruch Hashem, it wasn't put out in the old way because it was all truth dominated. And I have to, in addition to writing about it and trying to clarify some of these points in these talks and so forth, when I'm writing a Perush, I have to shift ground a little bit from the points that I made to incorporate the richness of this newly found orientation. But Derech Agav, when I looked at the books, I read Heidegger a number of times. I read Heidegger the last time was 1994. 1994! 1994! That's 18 years. 18 years I haven't looked at the book. Well, 18 years ago, it says in the margins, because I write in the margins, it says performative. It has all these underlinings about performative language, Sure, so I was on it. But I didn't develop anything. It didn't sing, it didn't ring, it didn't resonate. Now the whole Heidegger history of metaphysics and so on, it resonates. So much so, like I said, I have to stop one per page and write something on the machine. To write 70 pages on Heidegger and so on in 5 weeks is that's a lot of work. It's a lot of accomplishment. Just bingo, 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 bingo off the cuff. Okay. Tonight's talk is an introduction to explode the myths, to show the half-truth, and in the process to have brought out a number of points that give you an entry into what I'm doing and where we're coming from, and to understand how I'm going to develop the entry into metaphysics from the story itself. Now, I had this idea that when I read the text, that I always kept with the cosmology point, this is the cosmology, but I always felt there's something else in the story. And I said it. I said a number of times, you can go back, it's 50 years ago, 60 years ago, when I said there's something else in the story. It has to do with existence, differentiation, space, time, and what I called at that time filling the world with things, with living things, domesticated animals, wild animals, and so on. So I had this, and I said it many times, but that's where it remained. I didn't work it out. I had the intuition, the basic point, it's over 50 years, but I didn't work it out. Now, after this whole re-education, shall we say, I worked it out, and it's an eye-opener. It knocks you for a loop. And that's the Kiddush for tonight, why I call it a World Historic Talk. Because it's entering the Chumash world, and specifically the text of the Bereshit story, as saying this is showing an epistemology. It's starting with an epistemology, the nature of knowledge, like Descartes, but it's not quite epistemology, it's language, as indicated from the first very point that it says. God, Merachefet al Hamayim, what is God going to do? He's going to make a metaphysics. Good. Day number 1, light. Light in the Chumash text, in this context, means being, existence. You cannot see in the dark. It's as simple as that. If there's no light, you can't see anything. It's like the child. When you turn off the light, for us, it's a nothing. Why can't the kid sleep? Because what goes out of existence, it just disappears like that. And the kid is holding the teddy bear, but it's not powerful enough. The touch and the hugging, it's not powerful enough to knock out this point that I'm talking about. Light means, in the Chumash text, in the first day, means being, existence. I put it more specifically in terms of nothing is said about light. Right? You just called it day. Right? That's all it says. Vayihi he called the day, he called the light day, and the darkness choshech. So you don't get much information, much material to elaborate. But in the first day, we have the fundamental concept of epistemology or metaphysics, which is being. I call it being that and being what. Difference between the thatness and the whatness. The thatness is not determinate. That is not fixed. The whatness is fixed. A what is a something. A table, a chair, a book, and so on and so on. The relationship between that and what is one of the big topics in metaphysics, regardless of the entry. Each of the entries will deal with the topics, but in different ways. So in the first day of the Chumash text, Yehi Or, Vayihi Or, and what we have is being. Day number 2, differentiation. You cannot think without difference. It is impossible for the human being to have any intellection of any kind at any level without difference. Indeed, there's difference presupposed in the very first 2 psukim. Bereshit bara Elokim et Hashemayim v'Torah. You can't speak, you can't talk, you can't think, you can't put together a proposition without difference. Difference turns out to be the degree of sameness. And so, without a degree of sameness that has some sameness, you get the notion of difference, and differentiation is absolutely fundamental to everything in metaphysics. Regardless of how you enter, you have to come to the significance of differentiation, of difference. And so day 2 is the second ingredient, shall we say, in a metaphysics picture, entering via the nature of thinking. Again, I modify that with the language dimension because it sounds like entering with thinking with a kind of a tail. And the tail is the linguistic emphasis that I'm putting on it. But so you gotta keep that in mind, that when I speak about the entry being from knowledge, I mean knowledge not in Descartes' sense, who entered from the point of view of knowledge. Descartes, as I said, thinking was mathematical thinking. This was the great scientific revolution. where this does not exist in Greece. Greeks didn't have this entry. They had a being entry. Being entry, as you see. In Plato, for example, non-being is a form of being. What do you mean? Non-being. If you can put something in a sentence, grammatically, with a subject and a predicate, a noun and a verb, it's amenable to metaphysics. So non-being, well, I just talked about it. It has to be something. It can't be nothing. So what is it? It's non-being. Well, we got like Descartes and said, look, what the hell are you doing? I mean, let's enter through epistemology, through what we've got the scientific revolution now, where mathematics and mathematization is the key to the understanding of science. And so let's enter through that and we'll bypass this problem of non-being. We'll go underneath and ask, what are the entities that we have to deal with? What's the language we have to use to talk about them? Because you get befuddled. If you don't keep straight language of existence, the word existence, being, entity, thing. Heidegger writes, what is a thing? A common sense person have to tell them what a thing is? Yeah, of course you know what a thing is. This is a thing, it's a what? This is a thing, it's a what? And it's soda water. I mean, what's the problem? Well, for metaphysics it's a big problem. To understand all of this whole picture. So here's the entry, and differentiation in every single metaphysics, there's a place for differentiation, difference, sameness and difference. How it's done and how it relates to the rest of things remains open. Because metaphysics deals with the relationships between logic, psychology, psychologic, being, and knowledge. The four fundaments of any metaphysics are these four things, and how they interrelate gives you the, quote, differences between the systems, how they get put together. But that's what, I even wrote a nice piece about a game. It's a game of putting together four things, and how they fit together, like in a puzzle, is the goal. It turns out that when you make the analysis and you put the emphasis that I put it on language and so on, it turns out that the picture is never complete. It's always incomplete. So the artist who paints it, if he didn't put a signature on it, the painting is not complete. It has to be complete. And the message of contemporary metaphysics is, we must live with incompleteness and the insecurity that comes with incompleteness. And I'm not talking about Gödel incompleteness theory, that relates to logic and logical systems, but that certainly fits into the whole picture. The message of Yom Kippur is incompleteness, and how the human being must orient himself to live with incompleteness. When they throw the goat off the mountain, there is no ribbon. That's in the Chazal. It was a different period and they had a different slice of how they're looking at the material. But in the Chumash, they throw a goat off the cliff to Azazel. That was a kapara. If the goat, they had one part was a korban, which was done through the regular process, it yielded kapara. We're not important what that means at the moment. And so the fullness of the kapara required this goat being killed or dying from starvation, from broken foot, and so on, so on, so on, so on. But in the Chumash text, and the highlight of Yom Kippur is that we don't know what happens to the goat. That's the form of incompleteness. So it turns out that when you come from the side, here's this big picture of the metaphysics and so on, so on, so on, so on, so on, so on. And at the end, when you start looking at each piece of the Chumash, you're getting fillers, how the Chumash is filling in this whole picture that we're depicting in the metaphysics. But one of them, in terms of the showing, is that when Heidegger shows, in Heidegger already, not with my emphasis of the performative, but in Heidegger, it turns out the picture's not complete. The showing is open-ended, put it that way. There's no closure. Classical metaphysics was closure. you closed. You got the full picture. And so Aristotle, when he writes the full picture, what can you do except contemplate? Look at it and enjoy it. That's all you can do. It's not like science. It's not going to build a technology. It's not going to help human life or whatever. But you're going to contemplate it. But you made a closure. In medieval philosophy, in medieval Jewish philosophy, there's closure. In Descartes, there's closure. As we start to shift into the contemporary understanding of metaphysics, as I'm trying to present it, based on the Heidegger picture, the showing is open-ended. There's always more to show, depending on as society shifts, and me and you shift. When we're in the next generation, just the shift of generation brings with it a restructuration and redifferentiation of the components that we're involved with. And so what you have here is this is a shift, and some other time I'll talk about a new dimension of the Akeda story, Akeda Yitzchak story, of the what's from the metaphysical point of view, what's it all about. In other words, once you set up this beginning point, then you could ask about each story. You could ask these type of questions. Whereas instead of being limited to truth and falsity, and where you stand vis-a-vis truth or falsity, you're asking a whole range of questions that are coming in from you and your life world, cast in terms of the ingredients of the metaphysics that's being depicted in the first chapter. So the first chapter is the rubric. The first chapter gives you what the organization. It tells you what is this thing all about. What is the Chumash trying to tell you? In classical metaphysics, you say, like Freddie would say, it's all metaphysics. It's all up in the air, and so it's not up in the air. To it, when you start to examine the Chumash this way, you also go to your machine and write off the bat all kinds of beautiful things because you never looked at it like this. You have a new entry into the text. So first day is being, or existence, entity, whatever you want to call it. It gets refined as you go. But the main point about the first is that it's Vayhi or, Yehi or, Vayhi or, and this Yehi, Vayhi is the vehicle of the performative, which is going to be so fundamental. Number 3, day 3 is spatiality. In the ordinary world is where we begin. We're beginning with the world of human experience. In the world of human experience, space is a container. We're not talking about physics, we're not talking about anything else but the ordinary world. Space is a container, that, like a glass that contains the water. Okay? So, how is third day space? If you read the text, if you read in the cosmological thing, then you deal with what I said with many times. I even spoke about it. About the meltdown, after the last meltdown, the beginning of agricultural revolution, everything was water. And so the text picks up this orientation, and inside of this is the metaphysics that I'm talking about. So how is the third day space? Yikvu et hamayim. What's the picture we have? The picture we have is, here's a landmass. It's covered by water. It says, Haaretz aitab tohu v'bohu. It was surprisingly empty with no vegetation, no people, and no animals, and so forth. And it was bohu, in it. In what? Bohu, bo, in it. In the water. So the picture we have is water, and then submerged under the water is the landmass. In day 2 it was the water, but then there was like drawing a horizontal line through the water and differentiating. Second day is differentiation. The word havdalah, havdal, is all over the text. I don't have to read it for you. You read it yourself. Here was a line, and there was on top of the line and underneath the line, and there was differentiation. And of course, on top of the line was like I used to live in Far Rockaway and take a morning walk on the boardwalk before I go to shul. I used to take a walk and see the sun beautiful every morning. You see the sunrise. And of course, I got stopped by the police because they say, you don't do that, this is New York. You can't walk at 5 o'clock in the morning. Before. I said, well, I'm going to shul. Yeah, but I'm walking on the boardwalk. They had the cars that went on the boardwalk, the police cars, right on the boardwalk. And you see one guy, Meshuggah. Either he's lunatic or he's walking in the morning. Okay. So, in the second day, there was a differentiation. The third day is space. What's the point? Here was the picture. Here's water. The landmass was underneath. The water was pushed together. A yikvu et hamayim. The water was pushed together. Look down, like in mechanical drawing, top view, side view. I took mechanical drawing. You look down. What do you see? You see water and dry land where the water was pushed away. And the text says Yabasha. It says dry land. Proof of what I'm talking about. It says dry land because that's exactly the story. If the whole thing is covered with water, and here's the landmass, and you push the water together, so if you look down, there's water surrounded by land. Contained in top drawing. If you look at the top drawing, you look at front view, you see the 3 dimension. You look at the top view, you see the 1 dimension. And so when you look down, what do you see? You see container space. And so in the material, it's so exact and so simplistic and exact. I didn't write it, it says Yabasha. Of course. If you push the water together, you have the land surrounding water, and what is that called? That's called a sea. An ocean is land inside, land surrounded by water, like an island, like an atoll in the Pacific. If that was the topology here in this part of the world, the story would not say seas, it would say ocean. When you look down, you said the other way around. So the land would have been compressed. And you would have the geography of this area, if it was an atoll in the Pacific, it has a little speck, and then surrounded by the Pacific or the Atlantic is a big, that's an ocean. And a sea is land which surrounds the water. So we call Mediterranean, it's pretty big, but it's a sea. And because the geography, as you look at it, right, you see Greece, Turkey, and so on. You see the whole land, that southern part of Europe, surrounding the land. So day number 3 is spatiality, container space. The notion of space. What is space? Is there such a thing as empty space? Is space a body? And so on. All of these types of questions are the questions that are raised by the notions of the third day, which have to deal with space. Okay. I want to finish up tonight, this evening, by leaving the next 3 days, and we'll pick it up in the next session and make a 2-part talk. On the 4th day is time. The 5th day is what I call, it? 5th day I called ecology, the ecological, and the 6th day is the technological. And I'm not going to do it tonight. We'll leave that for the second time. And the 4th day, what's important here is the notion of time. And so what's in the 4th day, it's not necessarily the case that, probably not the case, that the constellation, the solar system was created on the 4th day. The 4th day is concerned with the measurement of time, with clocks, with a natural clock. A natural clock is when you have a movement that's regular and repeats itself. So you have the movement of a constellation, the movement of the sun. You get a sufficient beginning point for the development of a clock. Then, as civilization went on, we duplicated these things with the clock as we know it today, and it's the fourth day has to do with the measurement of time. So it calls them lights. It's the lights, and of course, it doesn't say sun and moon. It says lights. It doesn't say kochavim. These are the cosmic terms. Sun, moon, stars are cosmic terms. We're talking now about lights that function to tell time by. So what's being, quote, created, the bad word, what the fourth day represents is not the solar system. The fourth day represents time, clock, the measurement of time. And in the ordinary world, there is such a thing as time, and it's a big, big problem in the nature of metaphysics, and I want to save that as a separate discussion to build on the notion of time, where Heidegger and his metaphysics contributed most to the concept of time in the metaphysical picture, the whole metaphysical picture. His book was called Being and Time. He wrote essays on the nature of time and so on, in addition to other things about the nature of a thing, the nature of knowledge, how is logic, what is logic, is thinking logic, is thinking not logic, and so on and so on and so on and so on. All these complicated kinds of questions include in them what is time. And we're going to keep that as a separate, and then we'll get into this interesting thing about why I call the fifth and sixth day technology and ecology. How does that get into the picture? On the surface, the story is an agricultural story. The whole story in the Chumash, everything. Culture is an agricultural society. So the material, in addition to what I'm talking about, has an agricultural slant. There's no mention of rocks in the creation story. There's no mention of mountains. There's no mention of the inanimate. Well, if I were writing a creation story, it's cosmology, well, I certainly would put in somewhere. Like you say, so much of the universe is water, but there's a lot of land in the universe, and rocks and mountains and valleys, all of this. Where is all of that? Because it's an agricultural entry. And an agricultural entry, the agricultural entry comes in after the fourth day, in the fifth and sixth days, when we deal with wild animals, with animals that are not domesticated, and the sixth day deals with animals that are domesticated. And in the life world, the ordinary experiential world, the animals that are wild, that run wild, and so on, the insects, and so on, so on, so on, whatever, these are outside of the living space. But we have to worry about them. I call it ecological because that's how nature, as we're familiar with in the contemporary period. Nature has its own rules, and they're ecological rules. If a comet hit the planet, well, 50-60% of the planet will be wiped out. That means not just 9/11. So when NASA had this problem about something was coming in within a range, whatever the range was, but they kept it quiet because somebody said, look, you know, it is coming to an end. I mean, not because it's the 21st of December, but I mean, it, you know, and when we had these big tsunamis and so forth, so that the ecology enters the picture. How we're going to define ecological as a metaphysical, epistemological principle, I'm going to leave for next time. But the point is, there's an ordinary look at being able to live with the insecurity that comes in from the ecology. And then on day 6, there's the flip side of how the greatness of the human being can make things which enhance life and so forth and intrude on nature's way of doing things, which sometimes doesn't care who it is, what it is, no justice, no, and so on and so on. So we're gonna save time, and fifth day, sixth day, and Adam Rishon, how does he play in the picture? We'll say that for the separate orientation. So the point of tonight was just to illustrate the kind of an entry into a shift in the way you look at the whole Torah system. I'm a Torah man, and my concern always was Torah. When I watch National Geographic, it's always, oh, this puzzle comes to mind, that thing comes to mind, they're talking about this animal, oh, and for me, all those things they get like filtered. What can I glean anything? Can I glean anything about the animal? They're talking about a giraffe or a lion. So always something comes in, if nothing, nothing, something, something. But the point is, my entry was always looking for clues, looking for things that resonate in Torah. So if I could say something was represented as a lion, and I know something about a lion that came from watching a National Geographic program, well, that, when I will talk about that and write about that and so on, this little piece will find its place. Because what do I have to do? They're talking about giraffes, lions, tigers. What do I have to do with the picture? But if you filter it this way, then indeed it becomes a great asset. You get a fantastic education. You don't have to go to college. Okay, so the point of tonight was just to try to bring you into a different orientation to the whole Torah system, and especially in detail to the first days of day one being existence or being, day two being differentiation, day three being space, day four being time, temporality, five being ecology, and six being technology. One viewpoint, one thing about myths is it's not observable, it deals with numbers, deals with particles, it's very abstract. People say it's very abstract, like as you just illustrated with fruit. You go up the line and you have to shift levels of abstraction. What's good and what's true and what makes sense at one level of abstraction has to sometimes require another level to make the thing more clarified better. Okay, so it has unseen, it's abstract, it's God. That people who, somebody says, you believe in God? Yeah, well, that's metaphysics. That's metaphysical. It carries over to mysticism, where you say you're metaphysical, and this carries over to mysticism. But certainly, God is in the picture. It carries over to magic in antiquity. How did they understand the magic, whole phenomenon? And that's all. And one other view is it has no value for life. Indeed, you go through life. Do you have to reflect and study a domain which is, for the most part, irrelevant to your life? If you want to study the body, you have some psychology, do biology, and at least read articles, have material that's related. That's related to life. But this is related to the mathematician, to the philosopher, but not to the normal person. I mentioned once many times about number. What is a number? Well, that's a very big metaphysical question. It's not a question for a mathematician. A mathematician comes in the first day, he's going to deal with number theory. We're going to deal with Euclidean geometry. And then he talks for 2 minutes and says something about the Greeks and this and that, and now he says, okay, now we're finished, let's go and we do number theory, or we study Euclidean geometry, and so on, so on, so on, so on. So the working mathematician, who's closest to these kind of things, it has no effect. It has no effect on mathematics. It can have, anything can have effect on life, in terms of different results, effects, causes, and so on, but in terms of the subject matter, it's sort of using words, everything that exists. Well, is it something that exists, a being? We start to get befuddled right off the bat, and we're in a whole mishmash of terms and so forth. Okay. Now, these are half-truths. I call them half-truths because, in part, they are correct. So, first, abstract. It turns out that the history of metaphysics, like a field of study, has a history. And when you study the history, you see that there's a movement from the abstract to the concrete. In other words, as exemplified, we have, let's take three thinkers or four thinkers. Take the Greeks, Plato and Aristotle. Let's take Descartes. Let's take Kant. Let's take Heidegger. Metaphysicians, okay? So what do we see in relation to the problem of a myth, that it's abstract, it's too abstract? The history of metaphysics has shown that it started with what you would call high abstraction, but it's ending in the concrete. How so? Heidegger, who's one of the leading contemporary metaphysics people, who inherited the tradition and wrote on the tradition and developed this whole where he stands in relation to the tradition, he says, to show you that we're not talking about this myth of abstraction, he says, what I write in the books that I publish is not discourse about, it's not discourse about beings, it's to show beings. Woohoo! Now look, to write about something is that's much more abstract than to show the thing, to show the artwork, to show the painting. That's direct relationship. But so Heidegger says that the history of metaphysics shows you that everybody in a statement, or whatever, this is an apple, whatever the thing is, can you have an idea about that idea?
Sure, why not?
Everybody says sure. Now, can you have an idea about the idea of the idea?
Some people could.
Now, the question is, how are we going to differentiate between the first level, second level, call it just level for the sake of conversation? How are we going to differentiate them if there's nothing different in each of the levels? So you're going to say, well, label it first level, second level, third level. But that begs the question. You beg the question. The question is, what criteria could we use that will give us, if the proposition in the second or third level was different in some respect, okay, then you can keep going. As long as you find differences, you could keep going. But it turns out that this is a big, big problem. The question is, can you have more than one? Can you have a meta-meta level? Can you have a meta-meta level? That's a very big question, and that's a question of metaphysics. Okay. Myths about metaphysics. We'll call them half-truths. So one view is metaphysics deal with the unseen, with the non-observable. You can't see it, non-observable. Like numbers, particles, we don't see any particle. We see the localization of the particle in a medium, but we don't catch the particle. In philosophy of science, they call these theoretical entities. So what do you mean theoretical entities? In the sense that we don't see it. Numbers we don't see. We don't see Euclid's axioms.
The God particle.
So, huh?
The God particle.
Well,
we don't see the wind.
Wait. No, you're right. No, this is a big thing. Because there's no word for air. In Chumash, there's no word for air.
Really?
Wind is the word, not air. There's no word for air. Avir is a Hebrew contemporary term. There's no word avir in the text. Okay, so this talk is a world historic talk. And you'll understand why toward the end. But we're going to start with some high-level arithmetic.
Uh-oh.
You got a whole cup. 2 plus 2 equals 4. Clear, no problem. 2 plus 2 equals 4. 2 apples plus 2 apples equal
4 apples.
2 apples plus 2 pears
2 apples.
equals
4 fruits. 2 apples and 4 fruits.
4 fruits.
Like you said.
Okay. So, what do we see? That when we deal with numbers, clean, no problem. When we apply the number to something in existence and we observe, like the 2 apples and 2 pears, so what we see is that we have to put together 2 apples and 2 pears, we have to introduce a higher term under which both are individuals, part of the species, but we introduce a more abstract or a higher level term, then we say, well, yeah, it's not 2 pears, it's not 2 apples, it's 2 things, or whatever. Now, what happens is, as you start to apply this to more and more things, you wind up with something at the top called being.
Called what?
Being. Well, the Greeks, if you keep going like this, and you take other things and so forth, everything plus this, plus this, plus this, plus this, everything eventually relates to being. I want to start this evening by exploding some myths about metaphysics before we get into the text. And one of them is that it has no value. It's and these are I call them half-truths because they're true in part, but false in other respects. Okay, another example: the idea of an idea. Can you have an idea? You have an idea, relevant. And mathematics is the furthest away from life. I mean, you're dealing with something that's, quote, abstract. Abstract to the level where the mind makes it. The mind does all this. What about the body? What about the feelings? What about the rest of the person? It somehow gets bypassed in the whole orientation. So, the myths come down. Well, it has no value for life. It's you can live without it. And indeed, 99% of the population over civilization time have lived without it. What do you need it? What's the point? Okay. It's old-fashioned. Everybody knows that Greece was the beginning of philosophy, and the philosophy took on what we call metaphysics, and so we call it metaphysical philosophy or metaphysics. And then after the Hellenistic period, after the Greek world got linked together with the Roman period and the birth of Christianity, after that, God was in the picture and had to be dealt with in the metaphysics. So you didn't see him, and you had special property, and indeed you had the notion of infinity. And I know for myself, it took many, many years to work through the whole issue to realize that infinity and infinite and infinitesimal have absolutely no meaning other than in mathematics.
Man.
There is no such thing as infinite in anything other than mathematics. There, infinite does work. It has, we can have an infinite set, we can have subsets, whatever, but we can have infinity as a number and so on. But it could function in theorems, in proofs, and so on. and has meaning and carries meaning from the domain of mathematics. But it has no meaning in terms of anything else, including God. But God came into the picture as having to be dealt with by metaphysics, because metaphysics deals with anything and everything that exists. What that means, we're going to get to. What do you mean? It's